Hi, everyone. Welcome to Sandy K Nutrition, Health and Lifestyle Queen. Today, I'm going to talk to you all about shame, Gen X, because that's who I am, a 1970 baby, science, and really this confusing state of vulnerability, especially since social media and AI and everything has exploded. I think things have gotten very confused. I am going to bring science into this as always. I am going to bring a lot of soul into this as always, because if you've been following me for over 6 years now, you know that I do not believe that science can explain everything. And interesting, I was listening to this physicist, extremely scientific, prolific figure. Oh, gosh, what's his? I can't remember his name, but he's Italian and he is now changing the way that he sees consciousness, quantum energy. And I've done shows on this. And I've also done a show. It was actually my third episode ever. Forgive me for the fact that I was just such a newbie to podcasting back then in 2020. It was literally right before the pandemic. And I did an episode on shame. And I think it's time to bring this back in a more grounded sense than what I did back then. And I'm also going to bring in some of the works of Brene Brown. I love what she's done to bring shame to the forefront to understand really what it's all about. So, if you follow me, go to Sandy K Nutrition everywhere. And if you know my work, you know that I come always at it from the point of my heart and soul just to make this world a better place. So please, if you would, most of my podcasts are not sponsored. So I have had sponsorships in the past. And really, for me, we live in a world of one off marketing. And so far, I've been able to stay away from that. I do not charge people to be on my podcast. I want to come to you knowing so that you know that I come at everything from a very objective point of view. I'm not trying to sell you anything. I'm not trying to tell you to use my coupon code. I'm just trying to make this world just a better place and healthier in a body, mind, spirit, soul sense. So if you would do one thing for me, share this podcast with one friend, however you might do so. On social media, I'm Sandy K Nutrition everywhere or anywhere. I'm also on YouTube. And then the second thing is if you're listening on Apple or Spotify, especially, if you would rate and review with a few kind words, just engage with my content somehow, that helps me tremendously. Thank you. I'm going to start with a quote from Brene Brown. If you're not in the arena with me, also getting your ass kicked, I'm not interested in your feedback. And this is all kind of going to go to this entire topic of shame, vulnerability, and all of that, and Gen X. So I did a lot of research in this. So I am going to always refer to my research, but I'm also going to bring a little bit of soul in there. But I kind of I've had a lot of people who are close to me, not close to me, people on social media, you know, give a lot of their feedback. And I love that quote because it's true. Unless you understand what I do, please, don't criticize me. Don't give me feedback unless I ask for it because it's really not fair. We're not in the same, you know, playing ground, let's just say. So I do love that. Now, so I'm going to start also with Gen X and really the emotional inheritance, I'm going to say, we don't talk about. So I was born in 1970. I was born to immigrant parents who moved to Canada, who came here really without anything, suitcases. They didn't know the language. They didn't have help from the government. They had to get a job. They both worked in factories. My sister and I remember hearing stories from my mom that my sister's first language was Croatian, and she didn't know English. She went to kindergarten not knowing the language. And I am bilingual. I also speak fluent Croatian. My grammar really sucks, but I'm actually very proud of how I grew up. However, there's a lot of things with Gen X that a lot of people, they use it as a badge of honor, as opposed to talking about the way that we grew up. And it's pretty generalized amongst most of the kids. I was a latchkey kid. If you're listening to this, you probably don't know what that is. If you're younger, or yeah, like, you may not know, latchkey kids, they would wait until the parents got home from work, and they would let themselves in the house. They would make their own lunches. And I mean, there's pros and cons to this, of course. One is resiliency. And I'm a big believer that if you do too much and give too much to your kids, and you help too much. I mean, I know people who would sit down and do homework with their kids for hours. I never did that. And they were also they were also Gen X, but they chose differently. I didn't. I mean, there's some things that I've chose different, and I'm going to get into this. So, if you're Gen X, you grew up with an emotional landscape that was wildly inconsistent, and it really depended a lot on your culture, on your family system, and the country that you were raised in. So, some Gen X households, especially Eastern European, Mediterranean, Latin, Middle Eastern, South Asian cultures, expressed emotion openly. And emotion was part of regulation. This is a big part of what I'm going to talk about is emotion. And I put out a reel recently about crying. And if you grew up with the statement, don't cry, or if you caught yourself saying that statement, or if when somebody else cries, that makes you uncomfortable, well, you're going to want to listen to the rest of this podcast, because awareness is where it all begins. So, in those cultures, emotion was part of regulation. People yelled, cried, argued, repaired, moved on, right? And then there's other Gen X households. And this is where it gets interesting, especially in Canada, if you're Canadian from many, many generations, the US, the UK, Australia. They were more emotionally muted. You were polite, private, stoic. Feelings were either minimized or ignored. So, Generation X isn't just one thing. A lot of it depends on your culture and how you were brought up. But Gen X is a patchwork of emotional conditioning. I mean, speaking of Gen X, like, I'll never forget going to a funeral. I was young. I wasn't like a child. I was probably, I don't know, 20, 25, something like that. I wasn't a child. But I remember seeing someone throw themselves on a casket at a funeral. Like, if you want to talk intense emotion, that's pretty intense. And then, in a lot of cultures, you wear black for however long, for a year, to show that you are grieving. So it's very demonstrative. But then in some cultures, well, you have a celebration of life, and you tell jokes and you laugh and you pretend like there isn't a dead person in the room or their ashes are in the room. Like, to me, it's like, I don't get it. I understand that you want to celebrate the life of that person. But I mean, in my culture, Croatian, that's such a disrespect to the soul of that person and the dead person, that's we're supposed to be talking about. and grieving. So, my outlook, this is totally my personal outlook, is it's got to be a balance. I don't want people partying and getting hammered and drunk at my funeral. I just don't. I want to be, I want you to tell some good stories, maybe smile, play some music that, I loved and people remember me by. I don't want I don't want a big party. Sorry. That's just me. So, Gen X was the last generation that was raised without emotional language. And it's the first generation that's really expected to use it. Like, think about it. We're kind of in the middle here. I'm 56 years old and I'm in a public space and I'm trying to really learn and unlearn at the same time and heal some of the things that I grew up with. So, vulnerability is really confusing for many of us. And to understand this, we need to talk about the science of emotional tears. So, I'm not talking about tears that you get, if you have allergies or if you're sneezing. I'm talking about crying. The neurobiology of shame, the cultural differences in emotional expression, the Gen X nervous system, the distortion of vulnerability on social media. This is a big part. Everyone talks about being real, being vulnerable, but then you're like, what the fuck? Like, why is this person airing their dirty laundry like that? Right? Like, there's like a limit. Like, I am pretty vulnerable, authentic, all these words are being used, but like I'm not going to tell all my private shit on social media. And I'm certainly not going to tell you all about, everything in my life. Like, come on, save some for yourself. So there's a balance there. And then, of course, there's got to be some sort of a resolution to all of this. And I only provide suggestions. You might resonate, you might not, you might like some of it, you might not like all of it. I'm just here to provide some breadcrumbs. You decide if it resonates with you. And really, it's all about the deeper internal work just to rejig and find the balance that's right. So let's start with the body, because that's always fun. The actual physiology around tears that people don't really talk about. So we have three different types of tears: basal, reflex, and emotional. Emotional tears are chemically distinct, and it's not wellness folklore, it's biochemistry, although there is an energetic side to that as well. So, this research from biochemist William Frey found that emotional tears contain ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone. It's an actual hormone that is a stress hormone that's released by the pituitary when you cry. Prolactin, it is elevated during emotional arousal. Okay. So prolactin too elevated is not good. So if you're an emotional mess crying all the time, it's not good. Leucine, so this is an endogenous opioid peptide that modulates pain. Everybody's talking about injecting themselves with peptides. We have our own. We make our own. And these are very healing for us. And this is why, you hear that for every single ailment in the world, there is a solution either within us or around us that's natural. I think I heard that once from like the Amazon rainforest, like every cure to every major disease is there. Anyway, I do believe that we hold so much power within us that we can cure a lot of these problems. So if you're one of these people that can't cry, that won't cry, all of that, I'm going to get into that too. So there is a higher protein concentration in these emotional tears, and there are electrolyte shifts that are associated with the emotional load. So, Tears are part of the HPA axis, and I've talked about that many times. So, most of you know I am a registered holistic nutritionist. I do have training in biology, physiology, symptomatology, in the sciences as well. And I have many certifications. So, the HPA axis, that's the hypothalamic pituitary axis, and it is major it's in the brain. It's so much of our stress response to a lot. Even it gets involved in the thyroid response and signaling. So if you want to learn more about it, just look up the HPA axis. I think it's important that we understand that. So when you cry emotionally, your body shifts into parasympathetic activation. Okay. So parasympathetic is where a lot of us don't reside. A lot of us every day sit in sympathetic. It's where we're like firing constantly, right? So if when we cry, the body shifts into that stage where it's like more of a healing stage. So your heart rate slows down, your breathing deepens, muscle tension drops, and cortisol begins to downshift. So crying is not about losing control. It's actually neurobiological down regulation that the body kind of says, okay, I'm going to figure out how to deal with this situation. I need to cry. I need to release. And then you can kind of move on. You see? So, if crying is a biological regulation tool, then why does it make some people really uncomfortable, but others relieved? And really, it's all about what happens in their brain. So, why do your tears what do they do to someone else's nervous system? Okay. This is really, really important. And I am going to get into Brene Brown's work shortly. So, when someone sees you cry, their brain can light up in very specific ways. So, mirror neurons stimulate or simulate, sorry, your emotional state. Okay. So, there's a sensing of internal states. And then the anterior cingulate cortex activates. So the region that's involved in social pain. So your tears create a physiological echo in the other person. So how you're feeling and what you're showing creates a reaction in the other person who is witnessing it. So they feel something often before they even understand what they're feeling. And this is the bridge. So their reaction to your emotion is shaped by their emotional conditioning, not your emotional expression. And that, my friends, brings us to shame. So Brene Brown she's just phenomenal. She's done so much work on the neurobiology of shame. So she defines shame as, this is a quote, the intensely painful feeling of believing that we are unworthy of love and belonging. But shame isn't just emotional, it's biological. So, shame activates the amygdala, which is that threat detection in the brain. It also activates sympathetic arousal, fight, flight, right? Remember, I was talking about parasympathetic and sympathetic. So, it can activate that fight, flight, the sympathetic, which is not good to be in that state all the time. Dorsal vagal shutdown, freeze and collapse, and then social pain networks. So the same circuitry as physical pain. So this is why shame can feel like a punch in the chest. It's not a metaphor, it's actually a neural overlap. And here's the connection. If my tears activate someone else's nervous system, and their nervous system was conditioned to interpret emotion as a threat, then shame is the very first thing that fires. This is where Gen X becomes the key in this whole conversation. So, Gen X is the generation of emotional contradictions. Gen X is not emotionally uniform, which I mentioned. So, in the Eastern European households like mine, how I grew up, emotion was a regulator. People expressed, released, argued, cried, moved on. Intensity was normal, and emotional expression was part of survival. In Canadian and Anglo Western households, emotion was minimized. Politeness was prioritized, although politeness was big in my culture too, by the way. Children were told, calm down, be good, don't make a scene. Sometimes I'd get that too. Emotional expression was seen as weakness or inconvenience. How about don't cry? How many times have you heard don't cry? So here's the shared Gen X experience. No one explained why emotions happen. Of course not. No one taught emotional literacy. No one modeled repair. What happens when you do yell or you do freak out and cry? No one taught shame resilience. No one taught nervous system regulation. That's for fucking sure. No one taught that. It's like, okay, you'd lose your shit, and then what? And then what? How do you regulate after that? Trust me, you know, I've been the queen of this sort of talk for years. So the Gen X group grew up with emotional expression in some homes, emotional suppression in other homes, but almost no emotional education anywhere. That's Gen X. So now Gen X is the generation being asked to understand trauma and regulate emotions and communicate vulnerability, raise emotionally literate kids, navigate social media emotionality, and do it all without a blueprint. This is why Gen X can be overwhelmed by this. And now we're going to drop Gen X into the modern world. Like, think about it. Think about how we grew up, my friends. We had a dial telephone. We did not have remotes for TVs. We would turn it. That came later. I remember in my household, it was crazy. I can't remember how old I was, but my parents were extremely hardworking people. Okay. As I explained at the beginning. And they were big savers. They were frugal. They would save their money. They wanted to pay their home off. Like they were just so responsible. And God, like how and where did they learn this? I mean, they grew up living in dirt. My dad grew up sometimes sleeping in the barn with the cows. I'm not kidding. And I'm not exaggerating. So, how did they learn that? They learned. But I forget what my original point was. Oh, yeah. So I remember being like the first family on the street to have a central air conditioning system in our home. And people were like, whoa, you have a cool home. It's not hot. Like, this is how I grew up. So now, I'm going to get into social media and the emotional accelerant. Gen X was actually, we were never prepared for this. I just briefly explained how we grew up. Social media has completely rewired how we experience vulnerability. So, it somehow created this world where vulnerability is performed, monetized, weaponized, algorithmic I can't say it. It's rewarded by the algorithm. There, I said it easier. Used as identity, used as manipulation. And trust me, I know many Gen Xers who have adopted many of these models. And so all of this has created a world where people shame others publicly. People criticize from behind the scenes. People project their wounds onto strangers for fuck's sakes. Pardon my language in this episode, but I mean, I'm just so passionate about it. But I have to pause there. People project their wounds onto strangers or friends. I've been screamed at by people who say that I'm talking about their private stuff when I'm not. I'm talking about something that is a generalization with an age category that many people experience. I would never give private information, but I got slammed for it. And this is not the first time. It's been by strangers. For some reason, my words invoke or evoke this wound in people. And I'm like, I'm just out here trying to help people, not hurt people. And often when you feel that wound, you're triggered. I've recorded podcasts about triggers. It can create a visceral reaction within you, but that's not me doing it to you unless I'm naming you or doing something to shame you publicly, which I have never done. But that's a clue for you to look within. Like, why is what Sandy's saying triggering me? Trust me, I do that all the time because I'm a big believer in analyzing my own triggers helps make me a better person. If we all did that work, wouldn't it be a great world? So, um, so back to this. So people project their wounds onto strangers, people trying to inspire and accidentally trigger others. There you go. That's me. There you go. There you go. Comment on comment sections become shame factories, and then you see a lot of this. You're wrong. I'm right. Who are you to talk about this? I have more degrees than you do. And it's like a shit show out there on social media. That's a fact. I mean, I stay away from that kind of energy, but I've definitely been affected by it because others see me in this way. So, here's the connection. Gen X is raised with emotional contradictions, and now we're watching this emotionality become a public sport. It's like a public sport. And our nervous systems were never built for this, which leads to the next connection. If Gen X was trained to suppress emotion and social media amplifies emotion, then Gen X is living in a constant state of emotional dissonance. Interesting, huh? So let's get into the nervous system confusion. So science plus culture collide. So our biology is evolved for small groups, face to face connection, co regulation, slow emotional pacing. And now we have global exposure, emotional content that's 24 by 7, algorithmic amplification, public judgment, no context, no repair. So mirror neurons fire through screens. Social pain circuitry activates through comments, and shame triggers faster online because nuance is missing. So Gen X's nervous system is built for either suppression or intensity, but not this kind of literacy. And it's now like we're being asked to process this emotional overload. So no wonder it feels like too much. Trust me. I listen, I'm the queen of scrolling. I will never say I'm not. I do that, but often I do it for what's the I guess just to laugh. Last night I happened to be on this great algorithm. Everybody was out in my house, so I was by myself and I did scroll a long time. Shame on me, right? But I did, and I was laughing the entire time, and I really enjoyed that, and I think sometimes we don't get enough laughter in our day, so there's an option. So, the resolution. How can Gen X finally find balance? Because this is what it's about. And I've said this many times. Long ago, when I first started my podcast, I have a t shirt and it says, "It's all about the balance." Once we can find balance in our lives and what feels good, everything kind of falls into place in our wellness body, mind, spirit, soul. So, balance doesn't come from sharing more, crying more, talking more, although I do talk a lot in this forum, not always in groups or anything like that. Performing vulnerability, suppressing vulnerability. Because then you see that too, right? You see where somebody will only ever post about how wonderful their life is. And then somehow that can, again, it can trigger some people. And you're like, that's not my life. That makes me feel down. That makes me feel sad. Right? So it's these extremes that we're seeing. So balance comes from capacity, from bottom up work that rewires the nervous system. That's where it comes from. And there are a lot of different healing modalities. And, there's different ways in which you can heal. And I have been a huge fan of beam therapy with Brenda Ferrugia. I've talked about her so many times because she has changed my life. I have learned a number of different ways to really, I'm going to say, regulate and balance my emotions. And at the same time, heal aspects of myself that I may not even know is there, that I'm carrying. So I've done a whole show, maybe a couple shows on beam therapy, BEAM therapy. Brenda is the only person I know who does this. It was developed by a medical doctor, and beam therapy works with implicit memory, stored emotional charge, survival patterns, autonomic dysregulation, shame imprints. And a lot of this is sitting there in your subconscious. Remember, I can't even remember what the stat is, so do not quote me on this. I think it's something like 80% of our thoughts are subconscious. Don't quote me. Look it up yourself. But really, you know, I I I do believe there is a place for talk therapy. I do believe it depends on the therapist that you're working with. I have also done EMDR on things that I have found somewhat traumatic in my life. And I'll give you an example. This is a really good example. And work with a practitioner, therapist who knows EMDR. I did it myself because I felt equipped enough to do this. But what here's an example of where EMDR can really be helpful. When my daughter was diagnosed with cancer, a lot of these aspects of what we went through, and really a lot of it was me by myself because I was at home. I decided to quit my career and be home with my kids. My husband had to earn a living. So a lot of times I would do these things on my own. And EMDR is a great option for if you have almost like a visceral reaction to a situation and you know it's there, but you can't really break it. So, one of the things that I worked on in the past is this memory where I would go into the MRI with her, and she was 5 years old, and they would put these weights on her chest, and it was hard for her to breathe. See, like I'm still emotional about it, but I'm not, in a puddle on the floor over it anymore. But the sound of the MRI and that visual played over and over and over again in my brain. And so this is a good example of when EMDR is useful to try and break that visceral reaction. Because remember I talked about the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. If you're constantly in that sympathetic state, it can affect your health drastically in many different ways. So, balance, and then there's, somatic work. A lot of people are really into that. So, you have to do what resonates. See Brenda for beam therapy if you're like, I don't know, I have a problem, or every time my spouse cries, I get angry. Well, whoa. Let's break that down. Why would that be? Because when I see somebody cry, I wanna hug them. So, these are things that I'm really trying to get into the crux of, like, the triggers and just this dysregulation of emotions and shame and, the way that we grew up so differently. And even, I've done podcasts about marriages and there's so many different ways that people express. And this is why I always say you got to do your own work. But really, the fact is that balance looks like shame literacy. You understand it, you get it. Um, More self-awareness. People hear that term a lot, but they don't really get it. And I have heard unaware self-aware like, unaware people say, "Oh, well, she has no self-awareness." And it's just like, I just sit there quietly going, "Mm, yeah, okay." So, then there's emotional boundaries, accountable vulnerability, nervous system regulation, trauma-informed integration. So it's not performance, it's not collapse, and it's not suppression. It's integration. So I'll give you an example. If I have an argument with somebody, or no, not even that. If somebody says something who's a complete stranger on social media and it creates a bit of a reaction in me, instead of immediately commenting and going, "You're wrong. I'm right. Blah, blah, blah. I'm going to do a post about how wrong you are and shame you." You see what I'm saying? You can break the cycle and say, why is what this person's saying having an effect on me? Like, what do I need to look at? And then you worry about working on you, not trying to change their opinion, not trying to change their view, not trying to show that you're better or smarter or whatever. So, until you do some of the work, you might not get there. People talk about journaling, people talk about there's so many different tools. There's meditation, there's walking in nature, there's without headphones. There's so many different things. Now, I have to touch on this one aspect because there is a medical reason why some people don't show emotion. And I am going to talk about this because it's an important aspect, because there's some people who seem almost numb to emotion. They don't cry, they don't show emotion. So it's really important to mention that there are certain things that kind of shunt that pathway of emotion. One is if you're on SSRIs or antidepressants, that can blunt that emotional intensity. And again, I'm just mentioning this. This is not medical advice, nor that you should go off of them or anything like that because you want to feel more. That's a discussion with you and your medical practitioner. Hormonal imbalances will also create an imbalance in emotion. So, low estrogen, um, okay, you know how you hear, and I'm just talking about a stereotype about how Menopausal women can get really angry. Well, low estrogen can cause that. Okay. So, really high estrogen can cause an emotional reactivity, like lots of crying. Really low can make you just this angry person. Low testosterone can affect mood regulation and emotional expression. Thyroid disorders, listen, we all know I don't have a thyroid. So, I've been both hypo and hyper, and it can disrupt emotional regulation and mood stability. Trust me, I know hypo can make you really angry. I know this from experience. Then there's postpartum hormonal shifts. It can cause a lot of excessive crying or inability to cry. Then there's, chronic stress that can make this dysregulation. People who have issues with their tear glands that can make crying really hard. And then there's obviously people who have ADHD or autism. Um, then there's also trauma history. If it's really that intense, you'll hear people sometimes say, I feel sad, but I can't cry. So I want to make sure that I don't disclude these people because that's a discussion with you and your practitioner on, why you don't cry or why you don't show a lot of emotion. And maybe you're just that person who just doesn't. Okay. So, there's all sorts. So, when you cry, or when someone else cries, or when you see vulnerability online, there's a lot more happening than just emotion. So there's biochemistry, there's brain circuitry, there's the whole Brene Brown and shame research that's playing out in real time. There's Gen X's emotional inheritance, and it's very culturally complex. And then there's the whole digital culture that has made vulnerability both a buzzword and a battlefield. So the work now isn't to perform vulnerability online. It's to understand your own system and choose vulnerability from a grounded place versus a wounded one, attention seeking, all of that. Like that's really the work that you can go and do. I've given you a few options. You can get in touch with Brenda. You can also learn about EFT, emotional tapping, that's also powerful. There's a bunch of different tools that you can put into your own toolbox and share this podcast with another Gen Xer and see if it resonates with them and if it maybe might make this world just a little bit better to live in. Thank you so, so much for being here. Love it. I love doing this. And I really appreciate you all who come and show up each and every